Exodus 35, verses 10 through 19 in the Christian Standard Bible. Let all the skilled artisans among you come and make everything that the Lord has commanded. The tabernacle, its tents and covering, its clasp and supports, its crossbars, its pillars and bases, the ark with its poles, the mercy seat, and the curtain for the screen, the table with its poles, all its utensils, and the bread of the presence, the lampstand for light with its utensils and lamps, as well as the oil for the light, the altar of incense with its poles, the anointing oil and the fragrant incense, the entryway for the entrance to the tabernacle, the altar of burnt offering with the bronze gates, its poles and all its utensils, the basin with its stand, the hangings in the courtyard, its posts and bases, and the screen for the gate of the courtyard, the tent pegs of the tabernacle and the tent pegs for the courtyard, along with their ropes, and specially woven garments for the ministering in the sanctuary, the holy garments for the priest Aaron, and the garments for his sons to serve as priests. Here in this passage, Moses is having the children of Israel prepare the tabernacle for the way that God commanded. We see everyone working together for crafts, arts and crafts stuff, tailoring robes, decorating the worship area. Even though we're no longer under the law of Moses as Christians, we believe that aesthetics can play an important part of worship still. Dr. Nathan Gilmour, why do you believe God had the people of Israel put so much into the decor of their worship area, and what can the church learn from that today?
Well, there's really three things that are worth noting here, and one of them is what this holds in common with just about every worship tradition of the ancient world, and the other two are what make Israel weird. And what they hold in common with the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, and just about every other ancient people we can think of is that they do employ their artists, for the places where people go to meet God. So, every urban center that you got some kind of temple. You've got the best artists making images of the gods so that worship can go on. You've got, the best building materials, the most gold that you can put together. All of these things are true in all of those places. Now, the two things that are weird here, one of them is that this is a mobile worship center. It's not a shrine that stays in one place, but it's one that follows the people. And of course, that makes sense because here in Exodus 35, we are no more than 20 chapters out from crossing the Red Sea. We are out in the wilderness where these much more established tribes are waging war against Israel. And wherever God is going to meet the people, it's got to be where the people are. So it moves around. It's not a temple made out of stone, but it's a tent made out of hides. The other thing that is notable here is who the chief priest is. So, when we think about the priest character in a modern novel, it's usually someone who is relatively harmless. It might be someone who's sort of a moral character, a moral center. It could be someone who's a hypocrite. It could be sort of a comic bumbling character like you get in a lot of Jane Austen novels, but largely harmless characters. In the ancient world, if I can, slide laterally over to Homer, someone like Tiresias or someone like Calchas the prophet or someone like, Croesus, the high priest of Apollo. These are dangerous men. They have a relationship with the divine that makes them just extraordinarily powerful. And what makes Israel interesting here is that, first of all, the one who is talking to the gods, the prophet, is a failed insurgent. The first thing that we actually see Moses do as an adult is to murder an Egyptian, look this way and that, and hide the body. The other weird thing is, just 3 chapters before this passage that we just read, Aaron is on God's kill list. God says to Moses, these people, Israel, and Aaron is among them, have just created this golden calf to worship and said that this golden calf led them out of Egypt, not me. I'm going to kill them all off. And Moses, I'm going to start over with just you. And Moses goes to God. And, just in case we think that we believe in the power of prayer, Moses actually talks God out of killing all of Israel. 3 chapters later, God here institutes Aaron and all the sons of Aaron as the ones who are going to be part of this temple. So all of the conversations we're going to have about aesthetics today, I want to be sure that we remember these core contradictions inside of which the aesthetic conversation emerges, right? For the people of God, starting with Moses, going up to the rabbis and the Christians and everyone who is faithful to God. is that we are in some ways, just like all of the other peoples, very convinced that connecting our artwork and our life with God is an imperative. And I think that's right. And also, we are part of a story that in a lot of important ways is nothing like their stories, where you don't have a respectable family at the center. You have someone who has betrayed God. You don't have someone as your chief prophet who is, the descendant of other people who have spoken to the gods, but you have a murderer. And so, I mean, like I said, we've got a lot of conversations to have today, but I just want to set up that frame around them before we dig in.
Yeah. Hey guys, welcome to the Whole Church Podcast. We are back with our ecumenical aesthetic series. Excited to have Dr. Nathan Gilmour with us. He was a former religion professor. Currently, I believe you teach English at a high school somewhere. I don't know.
Yes, indeed. North Gwinnett High School. Go Bulldogs.
Yeah, that. But not the college Bulldogs. Not this year.
The iconography is almost identical, as is the color scheme.
Yeah.
I'm suspicious.
Yeah.
Anyway,
my elementary school was the Bulldogs, but we were green.
There you go.
But yeah, we're excited to have Dr. Nathan on. This originally was going to be the first episode in our ecumenical aesthetic series. But then we realized Pang and Taylor had some stuff that we had in common with them being Pentecostals. And we were like, you know what? Let's just start the series a week early. So we did that first. And now we're circling around to what was going to be the beginning to ask the question about why we should care about this stuff at all. Isn't it like idol worship to look at art in worship? Like, what's that? There's a lot of iconoclastic themes throughout religion in general, especially within Christianity, especially within Protestant Christianity. So, and I know a lot of our listeners are Protestant. So this will be an interesting one to discuss with a former religion professor. Really excited to get into that. But before we do, we have to introduce the reason everyone came. The whole reason people care about this podcast. We call it the Whole Church Podcast, but that's really just code for the greatest man ever podcast. This is really the TJ, Tiberius Juan Blackwell show. TJ, welcome to your show.
Thanks. If you like what we do here and you need more content, you just want to listen to more people talk, go ahead and check out the Anazel Ministries podcast network. Other shows like ours, shows that we're friends with, go ahead and support them too. And you can chat with us on our Discord server in our notes if you're kind of confused on how to get into that, or just have other questions you would like us to ask, or more specifically, questions you would like us to ask Nathan, and then we can tell you what Nathan said.
Yeah, that's really how it works. We're just, the middle people.
Yeah.
That's what we like to do here. Another thing we like to do, we're a Unity podcast, and I actually do have a favorite form of Unity. It's a spiritual practice of mine known as silliness. We're going to ask a silly question, and I'll discuss it for a little bit. And TJ and I will answer first today's question. Nathan, what scripture would make for the ugliest painting? This is like the opposite of last time. Last time we asked like the best Van Gogh painting. Now we're like, what's the worst Van Gogh? This one's ugly. Why do I keep going ugly? Why don't I ask what the best painting? What is wrong with me? Ugliest painting for a scripture. You know what? I'm going to be real controversial here. I'm going to upset some people. Jesus wept. I just imagine he was a real ugly crier. So I think that'd probably be a bad painting.
Yeah. And weeping is like the ugliest crying.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I just can't wait for the emails of how dare you say Jesus was an ugly crier. Listen, he was human. Sort of.
The puffy-eyed Buddy Christ.
Someone please make that art.
This is a much harder question.
Yeah, it is tough.
The problem is the word ugly is subjective. What is ugly? What is an ugly painting? If the painting was meant to be ugly, then it's not ugly. It's exactly what it was supposed to be.
You know what? Also, when was it Paul says my righteousness was as filthy rags? That's got to be a bad one. Especially if you know what filthy rags meant.
I'm gonna go with the same thing I said last time, which I have to look up the verse again because I can't I can't remember this, or I'll remember it too. Okay, it's Psalm 38, 5 through 8. My loins are filled with a loathsome disease. There is no soundness in my flesh.
He's going to keep reminding us all of that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Nate.
All right. Well, I'm glad TJ went that direction, because my first thought was, okay, they're going to expect me to go to the rather graphic adultery images from Ezekiel, but I'm not going to go there. I actually went in a direction that, kind of got deep, even though I was supposed to be silly, so I apologize for this. But what occurs to me is that the moment when David receives the news in 2 Samuel 12 that Bathsheba's infant has died is possibly the most psychologically horrifying moment for me in a horrifying book of the Bible, which is to say 2 Samuel. And that is when, David says, oh, the baby's dead, then get me something to eat, wash my clothes, and tell Bathsheba I'll see her in the bedroom in 30 minutes.
Yikes.
And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's horrible. And I'm just thinking, if a really skilled portrait painter painted the face of someone in that mental state, it would be and if they did it well, and I'm trying to take TJ's objection seriously here, it would be certainly a grotesque portrait, right? Now, if you did it intentionally, then you wouldn't call it ugly in the sense of you were trying real hard to do something pretty and failed, but it would be something that is horrifying visually, I think. So, I'm thinking sort of the Davidic portrait of Dorian Gray.
Yeah.
See, the issue, you if you're trying to create something ugly and you succeed, you have created beauty in its completion.
You're thinking
yeah.
Bad question.
And 20th century, philosophers, would distinguish between the ugly, which is a failed attempt to be pretty, and then the grotesque, which is an intentionally shocking work of art.
Two other acceptable answers would have been the painting of the women when Solomon tells them to just split the baby in two. That would have been funny. I don't think it would have been a great painting. Also, you could have just said literally any verse that Joshua paints would have been a solid answer. Yeah.
See, we're assuming good painting.
Yeah. That was on you.
So one of the main reasons we're doing this series is because of our belief that beauty can bring people closer to God and to one another, which is why you can't have really ugly paint. But we have a few questions we're asking everyone in the series to go along with that belief. So we're going to go through those real quick, and then we'll get into the more unique stuff in a minute. So Nathan Gilmour, could you tell us of a time where you've seen God in the beauty of creation? Outside, specifically, in nature.
Yeah, this one is a hard one for me, because I have always been fascinated with science. So when I'm in a new place outside, I'm thinking in terms of its geology and its ecology and meteorology and, all of these ways that I can map the things that I have learned onto the things that I can see. So what occurred to me, because I'd never really thought about this, is that, I really encounter creation as something given rather than something to be examined when I'm already pretty familiar with a place. So, I can think of moments where, a place where I've been 20 times before, it strikes me, it dawns on me that this is a place that is given by God. And therefore, it is kind of a spiritual experience. So, one of those places, is a state park not far from where I live, Fort Yargo. And, when I've been at the lake there out, reading or working or, doing whatever, there have been moments certainly when I've had that spiritual connection with it.
Nice. So the next one, we're asking everybody, would you share a moment with us, if you have one, that you have felt a special connection to a painting, sculpture, or something of that nature? It doesn't really need to be a religious painting, but just anything like that.
Yeah, back in 2003, I'm pretty sure it was. And listeners, if it was late 2002, feel free to email Josh and TJ and say Gilmour can't even get his dates straight. But it was actually the absence of an artwork that struck me in a spiritual way, because Colin Powell went to the United Nations to make the case for the invasion of Iraq. And in the hall where he made this case was a silkscreen print of Picasso's Guernica. And he insisted that painting be taken down before he made the case for a massive aerial invasion of, a highly populated area. And so, I mean, when that happened, I kind of resolved for myself that, when I became a professor, which, as it happened was about 6 years later, I would get myself a poster print of Guernica and hang it in my office. And I did. And it was there for 14 years. And I mean, I told that story anytime a student or a colleague commented on it, because it's one of those artworks that really has a connection with and really sheds some truth on a really, regrettable moment in human history.
Yeah. Wow. That's a good one. So another thing, there's been shown in several studies that there is a healing aspect to just kind of perceiving beauty. Do you believe there's a reason why God might have wired us this way?
Sure. I mean, and it's interesting. I come at this, not mainly through the Bible, but actually mainly through Plato. His dialogue symposium, I must have taught it 20 times, and I've read it, several times on my own besides that. And one of the things that, Socrates explores in that dialogue is this strong connection between the good and the true and the beautiful, the three traditional transcendentals. And one of the things that, beauty does, again, according to Socrates' account of it there in the Platonic dialogue, is that it gives us a rung on a ladder to climb up to towards the true and the good. So, I mean, the beautiful, because it approaches us through our senses, is something that is changeable. It ages, it fades, sometimes it disintegrates. But if we are inclined in that direction, then we have the ability to reach beyond ourselves and reach for what is true and reach for what is good. And, for Socrates, I mean, that is truly why we have poetry, why we have sculpture, why we have architecture, so that it can guide our souls towards the eternal. So, I mean, if we take that and, we go over to the letters of St. Paul, right? And I'm pretty sure this passage is in Philippians. If it's not, listeners, or for that matter, Josh and TJ, by all means, correct me. But, when St. Paul says, whatever is good, whatever is noble, whatever is true, think on such things, right? I get in trouble sometimes around New Testament studies people for saying that Paul actually knew the text of Plato, but that passage makes me think that he knew Symposium. That makes me think he knew Symposium. So, I'm trying to think what New Testament studies folks you have on your podcast with some regularity, but they can contradict me next time they're on.
So yeah, in 2 weeks, my New Testament professor will be on.
Awesome,
so we'll
awesome.
See. But there's so many places where Paul basically quotes Plato that it's like,
well, yeah,
it's hard to say he didn't.
The big one is in Corinthians, where he basically forbids the faithful to take people to court to sue them. And I mean, that I have found, I mean, the most influential text that does that is Plato's Republic. And I can't find very many texts other than Plato and Paul that do that. So anyway, that's another conversation for another day.
Yeah. A lot of the moderation stuff,
Yeah, your New Testament professor can give all the reasons why I'm wrong about that.
Yeah.
So, at some point, I think we're just going to have to accept that God wired us that way so that we think more things are beautiful, so we stay healthy. And that was the intention. That's how we're supposed to stay healthy in God's love. But, maybe not
the beauty in each other
today. Yeah.
I mean, I am always a little bit nervous when people psychologize certain theological realities, and beauty is one of them. So I realize some people are a lot more comfortable with that than I am, and that just means that I'm more jittery than most.
He's just nervous you're going to call him beautiful.
So before we get to the more unique aspects of this episode, we have another segment we're doing in each one for the Ecumenical Aesthetics series. We call it the Artist's Corner. We're going to go through a few questions here. We're going to do in random order. We probably won't get to all of them because we're only going to do this for 7 minutes. No more than 7 minutes. So we might get like one or two of these. But are you ready?
I'm ready.
So do you prefer hymns or modern worship music?
Oh, I prefer hymns, and here's why: because they are in proximity to and therefore have this strong influence from Spenser and Shakespeare and Donne and Herbert and Milton. Whereas, I mean, modern worship music is in proximity to and therefore bears the influence of the Beatles and Elvis. And I love me an Elvis record, I really do. But he just doesn't stack up to George Herbert.
Okay,
That's
so
fair.
does your church have stained glass? And if so, what's on it?
My church does not have stained glass. However, I have worshipped in Milligan College, which is my alma mater's, Seeger Chapel, which has a series of 12 stained glass windows, each one with symbolic representations of an apostle on the ground floor. And then on the balcony floor, there's a matching set of 12 stained glass windows, each one with a symbolic visual representation of one of the tribes of Israel. And I mean, I love those stained glass windows. Every time we go back, I make a point of going to Seeger Chapel just so I can look at them.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Does your church have a flag? And if so, what do you know about it?
My church does not have its own congregational flag. Now, I will say that, my church does work in the iconography of the chalice, the red chalice with the cross emblem, which is the symbol of the Christian church's disciple of Christ. And, that has come to mean a great deal to me because, especially in the second half of the 20th century and the early years of the 21st, it has come to symbolize, sort of our central worship act, which is the open communion table, the table of Christ to which Christ invites all. So, I mean, we don't have a flag per se, but we have a very prominent visual symbol that means a great deal to me.
Okay, so how do you use music or other art in your worship time?
Yeah, this was an interesting one because I, when it comes to, my private devotion, I mean, it tends to be fairly silent. But I mean, whenever I gather with my local congregation, we sing hymns. So, I mean, in that respect, both in the poetry of the hymns and in the piano playing of Jane Whitehead, who is among the most skilled piano players I've ever met. I mean, there's definitely an artistic element to what we do when we gather as a congregation, even in our tiny little, town of Bogart, Georgia, outside of Athens.
Right. If your favorite Bible passage were a painting, what would it look like?
So, because I am an imp, my favorite Bible passage is Proverbs 26 verses 4 and 5. Listeners, go look it up. It'll be better if you look it up on your own. And so, I had to think, okay, how would you represent that visually? And the best way I can think of is a confused looking person in the center of the canvas with identical people, probably bearded men, shouting at him from both directions, and, each of them pointing in a different direction.
Okay, yeah, I can see it. So what is the most unique piece of art that you have ever seen or heard?
This is going to be a weird answer, but when I revisited Washington, D.C. as an adult, I was about 40 years old, and I hadn't been there since I was probably an 8th grader. And during our tour of the Capitol, in the cupola, which is to say the inside of the big dome, there is this gigantic painting of George Washington being assumed among the Roman gods. So it is Jupiter and Neptune and Mars and Washington. And I thought, okay, first of all, if you told somebody who didn't know that painting was there, that it was there, they might not believe you. They might think you're yanking their chain. But it was sort of the crown jewel in a realization that I was picking up, revisiting Washington as an adult, of just how much of a Roman Empire fetish that city has.
Yes.
Yeah. Pretty sick painting, though.
I mean, it's gloriously done. I mean, it's really good painting, and it's also so weird.
Oh yeah, super weird. But it's pretty sick. So, does your church have any statues that we could discuss?
We do not have any statues. We are pretty darn Protestant in that respect.
Yeah. Most of us don't, which could be a good thing, or not. Who knows? Listen to the series. So, what kind of wall decor is around your church, and what is its significance?
Well, I mean, around the sanctuary, there's not a whole lot. I mean, it's a very typical looking, small town Protestant sanctuary. The windows are just, plain old clear glass. The paint is white. Now, I will say that above our baptistry, baptistry and Eucharist are just huge in the Disciples of Christ. or baptism and Eucharist, pardon me, are huge in the disciples of Christ. But above the baptistry is a painting done by a local artist of Jesus preaching at the seaside. So it's interesting. I mean, the way the painting looks, the water of the baptistry looks like it is an inlet of the sea at which Jesus is preaching. So, I mean, in that respect, I mean, it's a pretty cool little, artistic touch on a sanctuary that otherwise is kind of a typical, late 19th century, pardon me, Protestant sanctuary.
Yeah, that's pretty sweet.
Oh, yeah.
All right. I can't believe I'm saying this, but that is all of the questions.
Well, see, when you sent them to me, I knew I'd only have 7 minutes, so I wrote very short answers.
Yeah. You did a great job.
Well, thank you.
That was about 6 minutes. I'm impressed. 8 questions in 6 minutes.
There you go.
So, Dr. Gilmour, the main reason we asked you to join this series was to kind of discuss the history of iconoclasm, especially within the church. Before we do that, could you explain what the term iconoclasm means and where it comes from?
Sure. I mean, it's a compound word, as so many words in Greek are. The true genius of Greek is really its prefixes and suffixes, but it does have the occasional sweet compound word, and this is one of them. By the way, the languages that do compound words better than anyone are medieval English
German.
and modern German. Yep. But iconoclasm, I mean, in a very straightforward sense, means the destruction of images, right? So icon is any kind of representation. Clasm, is the root word of, our modern word clash. So, I mean, it is the destruction, of images.
Yeah. I think cataclysm is probably the most common word people will recognize.
Sure.
So what's the biblical basis for the idea of iconoclasm?
The big one, and the one that gets cited most often when Christians, write their treatises against images, is the commandment, from Moses in Exodus 20. Since we started the podcast with Moses, it's good that we're going back to him. It is part of the first commandment. If you're reading a Protestant list of 10 commandments, it's a separate, no, strike that, reverse it. It's the second commandment. If you are reading a Protestant list of 10 commandments, it's part of the first commandment if you're reading a Catholic 10 commandments list. And it is, you shall not make any graven images. Okay. So, I mean, grave, I mean, the same root word as engrave, or, it's basically anything that is crafted. And, the prohibition seems to be pretty specific about making images of God. So, I mean, for that reason, even those traditions within Christianity that do allow images and encourage images in worship will say that, when we're talking about God, the triune God, that making icons of the Son is permissible in a way that making icons of the Spirit and the Father is not permissible. So, I mean, other places where, the images come in are, of course, all of the places where, the prophets and St. Paul and other parts of the Bible, say that, we do not worship a God made with hands. We've got, Ezekiel 41 and Isaiah 48, both of which are sort of satirical send-ups of, images of gods in the worship of the nations around Israel. So, I mean, there's a pretty prominent strain running all the way through, the biblical witness that, idols are, at minimum, if you're reading Paul, simply representations of nothing, and maximally, if you're reading a book like 1 Samuel, the actual site where, the rival gods of the neighboring nations are present in ways that they're not present elsewhere. So, one of the things, and I feel like I've talked about this when I've been on Whole Church before, I tend, when I read the Bible across the books, I tend to emphasize the plurality there. I know some readers, prefer to harmonize. I prefer to look at each one in its particulars. And I mean, one of the differences that emerges is that, different parts of the Bible come to different conclusions when it comes to what exactly the other gods are. What all of them agree about is that there is only one God to be worshipped.
Yeah. That's We mentioned Dr. Michael Heiser actually been on the show before, and he passed earlier this year. But yeah, he's got some great work on some of that stuff.
Cool.
One of the things that I find interesting that you were talking about, even some of the books that talk about, no idols, we're going to destroy this, and these are just, made up things, whatever.
Sure.
They still depict God has his temple with these statues of angels around the ark, and the ark kind of represents God.
Right. Or statues of seraphim, let's be precise.
Yeah. How does that fit into the narrative of the people who are like very anti-imagery?
Yeah, I mean, the brief answer to that is that, worship traditions always exist in some kind of relationship with their neighbors. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we talk about the history of iconoclasm in the Christian tradition specifically. But I mean, the strong suspicion of images really emerges from the fact that all the nations around had images of gods. All right. So, I mean, the fact that when Solomon sets up those giant golden seraphim in the temple, and 3 chapters later, he is setting up images of the gods of neighboring nations in the same temple because he's married 700 women, most of them from neighboring kingdoms. There's definitely a strain in rabbinic thought that says, I mean, this is why you don't have these images because, I mean, they're a gateway drug to actual statues of gods, right? Now, on the other hand, if we talk about the reaction going the other way, one of the strong lines of argument, and we'll get to this in more detail later, that emerges in favor of using images is that, a strong iconoclastic streak makes you just a little bit too close to Islam for comfort. So, we probably should still approve of images. Otherwise, you'll become Muslim, right? So, I mean, what I'm driving at, again, is that is not that, either of those arguments is inherently valid or inherently invalid, but just to note as a historical matter that, these sorts of things tend to emerge in relationship with neighbors, right? And by the way, I mean, well, we'll talk about that later. I'm gonna give away all my stuff too early.
All right.
So what role has iconoclasm played in the church at large?
All right, so here's where someone who has read around in church history but hasn't ever taught church history is going to try to do a brief church history lecture. But one of the big distinctions that's important when we think about Christianity and images is a distinction that the iconoclasts say is no distinction at all. All right. So they say that, I mean, if you pay any kind of honor to an image during worship, you are violating the commandment against worshiping graven images, and that's the end of the conversation. Okay. Those who are in favor of images in worship say that there is a distinction between, and I'm going to use a couple Latin terms here, dulia and latria. Okay. So dulia is a respect and an honor, but it is a respect and an honor that one pays to one's created superiors. Okay. So and you're going to wonder why I'm going to this text, but I will get around to it, I promise. So in, Sir Thomas Malory's book, Morte d'Arthur, the great collection of Arthur stories, right? A lot of times when Lancelot or Gawain or, Galahad or one of the other great knights does something really heroic, really valorous, really impressive, Malory will say that the other knights worshipped him. Okay. Now, does that mean that they have become pagans and now they believe that, that Lancelot is, semi-divine the way that Achilles or Aeneas is semi-divine? Well, no, it just means that, in that, English tradition of compound words, that Lancelot has just done something that calls forth a proper response of giving shape, shipon, to the worth, weothon, of Lancelot. So weothon shipon becomes abbreviated because the Brits love to abbreviate words into worship. Okay.
Don't we all?
So that's the English have a particular knack for it. But on the other hand, there is latria, and this is the, the second and third syllables of idolatry. Okay. So latria is an honor that you pay only to the true God. Okay. And so, the distinction that, those who were in favor of images made was between dulia, which you can pay to those who are superior, right? So, I mean, to the Holy Virgin, to the saints, to even those people, in your life here among the living who are real spiritual exemplars, okay? And then latria, which is something that was reserved for God alone, okay? So this emerges a few times earlier, and then it emerges later. So in the 8th century and the 9th century, you have moments mostly in the Greek-speaking Eastern Christian lands where, in encounters with Muslims, because, of course, Muhammad is around in the 7th century AD. We're talking about the 8th and the 9th centuries here. Muslims are, writing and speaking polemics against the Christians, saying that they are no better than the polytheists and the worshipers of unclean spirits, because in their worship services, they have these images of saints and these images of this and images of that. And so there are certain Christians who, in response to that, say we need to purge Christian worship of those images because we don't want to give our Muslim neighbors an excuse to call us idolaters, right? And so once in the 8th century and once in the 9th century, you have gigantic movements in the Greek-speaking Eastern lands where, very prominent teachers and vast followings behind them start to remove all images and often destroy them. They are called iconoclasts, after all, in Christian worship spaces. In both of those cases, this is what's interesting, the Western European churches under the leadership of Rome, insist that images have a proper place in Christian worship. And just as importantly, in both of those cases, because the Great Schism of 1066, is it 10? No, that's the Battle of Hastings. Of 1043 hasn't happened yet. You have these ecumenical councils, so you have bishops from Rome as well as from the great Eastern cities of Christianity get together, and both at the Second Council of Nicaea in the 8th century and at the Council of Constantinople in the 9th century make official declarations from the overseers of the church, the bishops, that images do have a valid and important place in Christian worship. Okay. Now, the Great Schism happens, and, one of the few things that the Eastern Greek-speaking Christians and the Western Latin-speaking Christians still agree on is that images are still cool until you get to the Protestant Reformation. Now, here's where it gets, for my money, very interesting. Listeners should take note that this is the historical period where my own doctoral dissertation takes its roots. So, of course, I'm going to find this period fascinating. But in the wake of Martin Luther's teaching and the teachings of Ulrich Zwingli, there arises a new iconoclastic movement among the followers of Luther and Zwingli. And what's fascinating about this is that Luther is having none of it. The people who are Luther's followers start to destroy the art in churches in, the kingdoms that, are the Holy Roman Empire at the time. Now we call them Germany. And Luther, writes and speaks publicly saying those things are sacred art. Do not destroy them. They have a place in the church, so on and so forth. When Calvin comes along, he's a lot more suspicious of them, again, because of that strong sense that, bringing images into things. Okay, I'm going to say what Calvin said and then what I suspect Calvin also had in the back of his mind. What he said is it makes us too much like the old idol worshipers. What I suspect is also in the back of his mind is it also makes us too much like the Roman Christians. Okay.
Yeah.
So really this comes to a head in the mid 16th century, neither with Luther nor Calvin, but with a radical reformer called Karlstadt. And he has a debate with the Roman, unfortunately, he's most famous for his defense of indulgences. But he also made a defense of images, John Tetzel. All right. And in this debate, Karlstadt is an absolutist when it comes to iconoclasm. He says that Moses gave us this commandment. Moses did not revoke this commandment. God has never revoked this commandment. You will not worship images. And don't tell me about dulia and latria. If you are bowing down, if you are saying prayers, if you are showing signs of respect to a an image that human hands crafted, then, you are worshiping that image. And that really was influential far beyond anything that Karlstadt's churches ever exerted. Because, in Lutheran circles and in Anglican circles, you still have some religious imagery, but in I'm going to call them broadly, the Central European Protestant traditions, you have just a strong iconoclastic streak that lasts really up to the present moment. So, like I said, I am not a church historian, nor have I ever claimed to be one, but just from my reading around, that's kind of a brief, and listeners are saying brief, dear heavens, I'd hate to hear the long one, but a brief account of, iconoclasm specifically within Christian traditions.
Where do you fall, like, personally? Do you anti-images, for images, don't care at all?
Here's what I'll say in my own personal history of worship. All right. I have been part of the Stone Campbell tradition, which is pretty heavily influenced by Calvinism. And so, in my own worship life, I have never viewed images iconically. So, when we talk about icons, we're talking about, not images that are themselves holy, but images that stand as a sort of window through which one gazes upon the divine. Okay. So think of an icon as a window to heaven. Okay. In my history of worship, that's never how visual art has been presented. It's always been representative rather than iconic. With that said, philosophically and theologically, I can understand the arguments. So, if I were to say that, I personally see art iconically, I'd be misrepresenting my own experience. But if I would say that, there is no valid argument for it, I would be misrepresenting the theology of it. So does that distinction make some sense? Am I being too much of a weasel there?
Yeah. No, that's close to what I would say.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. So is iconoclasm an idea that we can coexist with? And can Christian unity exist between iconoclasts and those who choose to use icons in their places of worship?
Well, and here's where my ecumenical streak comes out. I think that in order to become an iconic worshiper, right? In other words, someone who can receive the gift of an image that is a window to heaven, it takes a certain kind of discipleship. And it's not the kind of discipleship that I've ever been under. So, my pluralism is going to say, and my humanism is going to say that, I can call Orthodox and Lutheran Christians my sisters and brothers, right? If I were to worship with them, and when I worship with them, I shouldn't pretend that that's a hypothetical thing. When I worship with them, I still experience that worship service as somebody else's worship service, if that makes some sense, right?
Yeah.
So coexist, certainly, but I'm also wary of an ecumenism that is so eager for unity that we pretend that our historical differences don't condition us at all, because I think they really do.
Right. So you mentioned it. You beat us to the punch. You are part of the Christian Humanist Project. Yeah. So humanism has its own own corner of the Renaissance arts.
Yes.
Does your connection with humanism as such influence your perspective on worship in art?
Oh, certainly. And, one of the things that's so interesting about, especially the Italian Renaissance, right, is that you get this, I think it's glorious, even though it's alien, right? But you get this glorious incorporation and appropriation of classical symbolisms into Christian worship spaces. All right. So I'll preface this by saying that I once heard Tony Campolo, the famous Baptist preacher, on a podcast say that, when he went to the Sistine Chapel, that's not Christian art, that's pagan art. Because you got, God represented like Zeus, and you got all the saints represented like ancient Roman heroes, and, so on and so forth. I am more inclined to say that when, for instance, Dante has the legendary and mythical King Minos being the judge of the dead, he is making a bold theological statement that, when those old artists and poets who did not know Christ talked about King Minos as a judge of the dead, that they were onto something allegorically that they could not understand theologically. And that goes for, Dante incorporating, Cato of Utica in Purgatorio. It goes for, all of the wonderful things that he does in the Commedia. It also, I think, goes for all of the ways that Michelangelo and Donatello and all of those Italian artists, right, are bringing classical, which is to say, those who did not know Christ, imagery into Christian spaces, right? So I don't have a problem with, Moses, at the Basilica of St. Peter looking a lot like what Cato of Utica gets described as in Dante's Purgatorio. I don't have a problem with the giant white-bearded muscle man that's on the Sistine Chapel because I don't think that Michelangelo there, just like I don't think Dante, is being literal, right? It's not that there is a god called Jupiter who stands alongside the God who led the Hebrews out of Egypt, but rather what people unknowingly paid homage to and worshipped about Jupiter. To the extent that those things are true, they are true not of that false god, but of the true God. All right.
Yeah.
And this is part of my well documented and long running love-hate relationship with C.S. Lewis. At the end of the last battle in the Chronicles of Narnia, I think that he is right on target where he says, to the extent that a Tash worshiper does what is noble and good and merciful and kind, that he's truly worshiping Aslan. And, that's not just because of C.S. Lewis. It's also because, recently my good friend, Jeff Satterfield at our church has been teaching through Acts. And one of the things I notice is that when St. Paul, especially, other people in Acts 2, but especially St. Paul, talks to the people of, let me back that up. When he talks to the non-Judean people of the cities of Europe and Asia, he says things like, God is no respecter of persons, but anywhere that a human being is good, God honors that. And I'm thinking, oh, holy cow, that's the New Testament. That, that's, that's not something that I'm importing in from my, pagan philosophers. That's St. Paul.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much that's just, it's interesting how people do these things. Like, just like, the same people who complain about people not taking Bible verses in context look at Michelangelo's work and won't take it in context.
And I'm probably saying it wrong. Say it your way.
Oh, you're probably right. I just don't know how you said it. But they are the same people who complain about him depicting God as white instead of thinking of it in that context, right? So it's funny that you complain about context in one area, then forget about it in the other. It's also funny that people who are anti-context still have a much easier time reading Song of Songs going, wait a minute, I still don't have to think long necks are beautiful. That was just a cultural thing. Like, they get that a lot easier than they get some of the God stuff in the Bible. It's like, some things are they just change, man. But the thing, what were you going to say?
I was going to say it was Aquinas' fault we think he's white.
Oh, yeah, true. We're known to be anti-Thomas Aquinas on this show, but that's like church unity except for that guy.
And listeners, I love Thomas Aquinas, so I am once again the troublemaker and the interloper here on the Whole Church podcast. I am the test of how seriously they take church unity.
So it's interesting. A lot of iconoclasts, because you mentioned they're okay with depicting pictures of Jesus. It's also interesting.
Well, no. The iconoclasts absolutely are not.
Oh, they're not okay with Jesus.
No.
either.
No.
I thought they were okay with Jesus, just not God or the Holy Spirit.
No. Okay, so I mean, even among those who are iconodules, which is the technical term for it, but that sounds like a silly word, so I usually don't use it.
That does sound silly. I like it.
But even among iconodules, usually they will make a distinction between representing God the Father, which they still prohibit, and representing God the Son, which they will allow.
It's interesting. I feel like
now, like I said, that's where Michelangelo would fall afoul of everyone in the 9th century, not but just the iconoclasts.
A lot of our lower liturgical churches today probably are more on that lines, because you see these things of like a kid had a dream and they paint that Jesus with green eyes, and that's cool. But if you painted a picture of God, we don't like that so much.
Right.
And it's also interesting that it tends to be more pictures. like they're okay with like poems that describe God or like,
oh, sure.
you know, writings that describe it. Like that is still a form of art. Music that's talking about who God is, you know, all of that stuff is art that is depicting God, and that's fine. It's just specifically images, and that's what's interesting. You know, I wouldn't say right or wrong, but I just find it interesting that that distinction's made.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and you know, I think of the extraordinarily memorable character of God the Father in John Milton, you know, arguably the great Puritan poet, right? You know, if there is an iconoclastic Christian tradition, the Puritans are it. But you know, their great poem, Paradise Lost, I mean, has, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of lines in which the Father is a character.
Yeah. I think part of that comes down to, which I don't know, this is universal, but I feel like when you are hearing descriptions of something that is not supposed to be knowable, you can almost feel it. You can feel like you're close to being able to comprehend it. You're just not there. And trying to write that down is kind of where you go wrong, because you're not supposed to be able to.
Right. And TJ's very deep answer is good. I mean, the shallower Gilmour answer is that the Bible narrates scenes with God in it. So since there's actually biblical precedent, people are generally less antsy about it.
Yeah. So is there another piece of art or aesthetics in your church that you get excited about and would like to discuss? Because, you know, you already talked about like the baptism pit painting.
Yeah. I mean, that's really the most prominent piece of visual art in our church. I mean, you know, the architecture of the church itself, I mean, you know, is something else that I'm excited about. I mean, only because it is so commonplace that most people don't think about it. But I mean, the fact that even though, you know, it comes from a tradition that, you know, is traditionally antsy about visual representation, you still have the steeple at the front of the church with a cross at the top of it, right? So, I mean, you know, there's still, you know, that I think architectural callback to, you know, the passage in Gospel of John, and I didn't write down this passage, where Jesus compares himself to the snake that is lifted up in the wilderness, you know, so that the people can be delivered from the venom of the snakes, right? And, you know, I mean, every small town Protestant church that has that steeple with the cross on top is a symbolic visual representation of that passage in John. And I dig that.
Yeah, I love that. Also, this is just like a side fact for everybody. I am personally really glad that those crosses on steeples aren't crucifixes. I don't particularly have a dog in the fight of crucifix versus empty cross. I just don't want to be looking up at a tall crucifix over the skyline.
Yeah,
the empty cross looks better
good
there.
thing you don't live in Rio de Janeiro then.
It is.
That's different. And a great set piece for Godzilla King of the Monsters.
That's true.
But no, I do feel like sometimes it could be unnerving, you know, at night living in Rio to look up and you see the crucifix.
I think that's absolutely the point of that statue, right? I mean, there is in a very visual sense, Christ is looking down at you always.
Yeah.
Also, TJ, grab your pen. Wrong opinion. I don't particularly like that statue. It's one of my wrong opinions. Yeah, I just wanted to add that to the list real quick.
So, but yeah, people go hard for their church architecture, their Christian architecture. Y'all remember when Notre Dame burned down?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
They rebuilt that so fast. They raised like, what was it, $2 billion in a week or something ridiculous?
Yeah.
That was pre-pandemic. You guys remember that? I barely do.
Yeah. If it had taken 2 weeks, I might have donated $5.
Yeah. So, like we said, Christian Humanist Project, Nathan Gilmour, check them out. You might like what you see. You might be interested.
Yeah, or here at any rate, we don't do video.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, outside of paintings or statues, one thing we're asking everybody for this series, instead of our usual ending question, we like to ask, what is one kind of art that you think people could get into that might help us all draw closer to God and one another?
So what immediately occurs to me is something that has been done poorly, so I don't want to get too many associations with the really bad versions of this. But I think that enactments, I think that drama is something that has a real power because it is human bodies moving around and speaking to each other. And, you know, what I would love is, you know, something like the film Jesus of Montreal. If you've ever seen that one, you know what I'm talking about. If not, go see it. But the premise of this movie is that a flailing Catholic parish in Montreal hires a crew of out of work actors to do their passion play. And what ends up happening is this gloriously done but theologically marginal version of the Passion. And what's fascinating about the film is that the actor who plays Jesus slowly takes on attributes of Christ until at the very end he actually recites word for word Jesus's and I forget the biblical studies name of this, but his oracle against Jerusalem from Mark 13, except instead of Jerusalem, he's looking down on Montreal and, talking about the destruction of Montreal. It is a wonderful, wonderful movie. And what I think of is not that every church should go try to find out of work actors to make theologically marginal passion plays, although that could be awesome, but that the church should tap into its high school teachers and its educated people and its people who do community theater and actually think about what would it look like to do complex and, how to put this, historically informed dramatic art in the churches. I think that could really have some potential.
Yeah. I'm gonna tell myself a little bit. At church camp and like other, big events growing up, I was a part of the same church TJ goes to now, the Church Got a Prophecy. And I am thankful for my terrible memory, because usually I dislike the dramas and stuff that people do, because they're usually not done very well. And then every time someone announces a drama, I'm like, oh. And because of my terrible memory, I could never remember the name of the one church that actually did it really well. But every time they got up, I was like, ah. And then they start going, I was like, oh, this is those guys. I got so excited. It was great.
Yeah, and I mean, what I try to remember, and it's hard for me sometimes to remember, is that the phrase Christian art encompasses the worst VBS skit you've ever seen, and it encompasses Shakespeare's tragedies.
And Fireproof. Just gonna throw that in Fireproof.
And I'll let other people decide which end of the spectrum that one tends towards.
So what do you think we would see change in the world around us and the Big C Church if everyone took the time to invest in that, the good drama?
I think that it would be a kind of discipleship. And again, this is not something that, has never existed or never been tried. I mean, the plays of Shakespeare, just to start with, are just incredibly formed by biblical texts, right? So, I'm not saying that every church has a Shakespeare in it. What I am saying is that
that'd be nice.
Just about every church has people who have read Shakespeare. And, if we start to actually let God give us the gift of Shakespeare, and if we let God translate that into some new original drama that, actually shows some of that influence, one, I think that our witness to the public really could be something that, invites complexity and confesses our sins and, introduces possibilities of grace, the way that, frankly, Shakespeare's plays do. And the other thing I think that it would do is it could really break the stranglehold of simplistic theology on us, because one of the great things about teaching Shakespeare at the Christian College, which I did for 14 years, is that, we really got to dig into, okay, what is Shakespeare doing here theologically?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Also, a free piece of advice for any churches out there. I think the best way to do this isn't to find your pastors that aren't doing that much and try to get them to learn how to do a good play. Your most Bible guy and be like, yeah, you learn how to do a play, grab some kids. Yeah, find the people who know the play stuff and teach them the Bible. Do it that way. I think it'll turn out better.
Yep.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, it's about the passion. If you're not in it, you don't care about it, it's going to be bad. It doesn't matter how skilled somebody is.
That's true.
You got to hire for the passion.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, we like to ask everyone to share a moment that they saw in God recently, whether that be a blessing, challenge, moment of worship, whatever it may be. And I always make Joshua go first because to give our guest plenty of time to think. And me.
I'm going to do 3.
Cool.
We missed last week, so I'm going to cheat. I'm going to pull a Christian Ashley on everybody. Number 1 happened 2 of them actually happened during this episode. One of them was our biggest patron, our favorite patron, maybe our longest running patron, Russell Gentry.
Russell.
Shout out to Russell. He donates enough we're supposed to say his name every episode, but we forget. He sent me a picture with him and his kids during this episode because he got the t-shirt that patrons get after 6 months, which we just started 6 months ago, was why he just now got it. Otherwise, he would have got it way longer ago. And he looks good. They look happy. It was good to see him and good to see whole church merch out there. Let's see, other God moment that happened during this, because this last week I started back at Chipotle, and some stuff that we were talking about flagged things that I was learning or relearning, thinking about with Chipotle. We're about to open a new store. That's why I'm going. So I'm training at one place to open a new store that hasn't had anybody there yet. And we're thinking a lot of like how it looks and how we do things really sets the tone. So the store we're training at, I'm going to tell them a little bit. They have rubber bands for certain things that should be actual equipment holding things up. There's pieces of stuff that's missing. The floors are dirty. And you can tell when the store looks like that, guess what? Workers come in and that's what they're thinking. You set the tone. They realize, oh, we don't care that much about this place. And it does show. And when your manager comes in with a dirty hat, dirty shirt, guess what? They're thinking, oh, it doesn't matter that much. And I think that can translate to how we view aesthetics at our church, right? When we dress like this is something that matters to us, or if we dress casual, that's going to set the tone for how our worship service goes. What kind of stuff's on our walls, what the church looks like, even the tallness of the building. I think whether you want a sense of awe or whether you want a sense of community, like everything about our aesthetics of the church says something. It sets the tone for our worship services that happen there. So that was number 2. And number 3, also because I've been working at Chipotle, I've been reminded that I do have this gift of being able to train people and work with them and teach. And it's something I haven't been doing for a while. So it kind of triggered that verse, that people like to quote that, stir up that gift that's within you that gets taken out of context a ton of times. But I'm thinking of it and I'm like, no, this is something I haven't been doing. And maybe I should be doing this in a church context too. Doing a little bit more discipling, teaching kind of stuff. Because I was like, oh yeah, that's right. I do have a gift. So I should probably use that. Yeah. So a challenge, a blessing with Russell. And I feel like I did all 3. Yeah.
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 You were cursed.
Yeah. My curse.
Returning to Chipotle.
I love Chipotle personally.
Me too.
Speaking of which, Carne Asada's back, guys. By the time you get listening to this,
that's my God moment.
Yeah. Wait, is it really?
No, it's close though.
I was teaching everybody how to do it today. They were like, "Wait, this is good." They showed us yesterday, and it wasn't. And I was like, "It's because he showed you wrong." Carne Asada is good.
Yeah. We're fully shilling at this point. Go to your local Chipotle. Try out the Carne Asada. It's delicious. The first ever return limited time offer.
Mm-hmm.
Check it out.
It's based off of what is it? North Mexican themed foods. It's a fragrant spice, cilantro, cumin, chili.
Yeah, check that out.
Please do your God moment. We're not sponsored. Not sponsored.
Well, it kind of is because we work there. But
that's true. They do pay us. We use that money to do the podcast.
So. For me, my God moment is going to be also about Chipotle, but in a very different way. It is seeing people's ability to forgive. Because in a store setting, you can see if a close goes poorly, you can see some of the angriest people that have ever existed, the openers.
It's true.
And it's just amazing to see how time can sate that wound enough for the closer and the opener to talk about it, come to an agreement over it, and not fight each other by the time they see each other.
Mm-hmm. Were you the opener?
Yeah, it's me. Yeah, it was me.
You're amazed by your own ability to forgive.
Yeah, that's God.
All right, good stuff.
That was a challenge, actually.
So first of all, I've got to apologize because because I live in North Georgia, my burrito loyalty is completely on the side of Willie's, not on Chipotle. So I do apologize for that.
Know what Willie's is. It's fine.
It is a chain of burrito as big as your head places that is, I'm pretty sure, exclusively North Georgia. So, but my God moment. Let's get away from burritos and towards God. Although, is
God is in my burrito.
Is God present in the burrito? I'm pretty sure there was a medieval debate about that at some point. But my God moment, I mean, on one hand, I'm tempted to think of this as just my vanity, but I really do think that it is a moment where God is starting to heal me, because my professor career ended under very bad circumstances in very ugly ways. And this last week, I've been doing an event called Socrates Cafe at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at University of Georgia for about a year now. And, its roots are in the book by Chris Phillips, Socrates Cafe, and then also in an event that I did at Emmanuel College for 11 years that we called the Emmanuel College Socrates Cafe. But, the fact that I was back on a university campus doing philosophical things and discovering, I mean, to my honest surprise, that I could still do it well was really something that brought something back to me, because I realize rationally that this is superstitious and it is completely unreasonable. But I have had this pervasive fear ever since I packed up the last boxes in my professor office that I wouldn't be able to do things like write or preach sermons or lead philosophical dialogues or do those sorts of things that I associated with that chapter in my life. So every time I have a chance to do one and it goes well, it is, on the one hand, absolutely my vanity. Okay, so I'm not going to pretend that my vanity is absent here. But it's also a moment where God reassures me that this very ugly and very painful moment in my life didn't take away everything. And boy, that's a reassurance that I need right now.
Man. Yeah, I'm glad he went last.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
I not as many burritos. I'm sorry for that.
Way less.
You'll get around to it. Just wait.
Yeah, it launches tomorrow. So, yeah, if you like this episode, please consider sharing with a friend. Share with an enemy if you have them. Share it with a cousin. We love our cousins. We hope you love your cousins. If you don't, send them this anyway.
Maybe you'll learn to love them as they hear TJ's God moment. Yeah.
And if you're listening on the AMP Network YouTube channel, hit like and subscribe. It helps so much.
That's true. Yeah. Speaking of the AMP Network, the Anazal Ministries Podcast Network, make sure you go check out some of our other shows there. We have another one I do, the Dummy for Theology podcast. I'm trying to think of some other ones. Check out the Bible After Hours. It's it's a little raunchier, a little more progressive, but I think it's good stuff. Some good Bible takes, and of course, Christian Ashley, friend of our show, Let Nothing Move You. He's going through Romans right now, so it's always fun to hear about Romans.
Yeah. We hope you enjoyed it. Come back next week. We'll be continuing our ecumenical aesthetic series with Pastor Will Rose and Reverend Keno Kennedy to discuss our favorite pieces of art from other Christian traditions, which for me is all of them, pretty much. And then Brother J.R. Martin, Dr. Peter Link, and Dr. Peter Beck will be on with us to discuss how imagery is used in the Bible and the symbolism in some of our church flags, which they're all on the same episode, right?
Yeah, Brother Martin, I'm not 100% how confirmed that is. That's like a 50% confirmed. Yeah, he may or may not be there. The other ones will be.
Yeah, that's probably like a must-listen episode if everyone shows up.
Yeah.
So after that, Pastor Shana Watson of the Anglican tradition will be joining us to discuss art unique to her tradition, which is a surprising amount. And finally, at the end of season 1, Francis Chan will be joining us to talk about his ecumenical aesthetics.
Yeah, he doesn't know about it, though. So someone should let him know. It's probably important. Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Who knows? Sign the petition.
Yeah.